The morning sun cast long shadows across the Ukrainian farmland as Elena Petrov loaded another crate of ammunition onto the old truck. Her calloused hands moved with practiced efficiency, each box weighing nearly 40 pounds. She had been doing this work for 3 months now, ever since the war had reached their small village outside Kharkiv. What started as a simple job moving supplies had become something much more dangerous. Elena was 26 years old, with dark hair always tied back in a practical bun and eyes that had seen too much in recent months. Before the war, she had worked as a veterinarian in the village, caring for the farm animals that were the lifeblood of the community. Now, those same steady hands that had once delivered calves and treated injured horses carried boxes of bullets and grenades to Ukrainian soldiers fighting on the front lines. The truck belonged to her neighbor, Mikhail, an older man whose son was fighting somewhere near Donetsk. Mikhail had volunteered his vehicle for supply runs, but his arthritis made the heavy lifting impossible. Elena had stepped forward without hesitation. Someone had to do it, and she was young and strong. Another load for the eastern checkpoint, Mikhail called out from the driver's seat, checking his watch. "They're expecting us by noon." Elena nodded, wiping sweat from her forehead despite the cool October air. The eastern checkpoint was one of the more dangerous runs. It sat only 15 kilometers from active fighting, close enough that they could sometimes hear the distant rumble of artillery. But the soldiers there needed supplies desperately, and regular military convoys had been targeted too often by enemy forces. As she lifted the last crate, Elena noticed her hands were shaking slightly. Not from the weight, but from something else. Fear, maybe, or just the constant tension that had become part of daily life. She took a deep breath and pushed the feeling down. There was no room for fear in this work. The truck rumbled to life, black smoke puffing from its exhaust pipe. Mikhail had managed to keep it running despite the shortage of spare parts, using creativity and determination that impressed even the mechanics in town. They pulled out of the village, past houses that showed the scars of earlier fighting. Some had been repaired with whatever materials people could find. Others stood empty, their windows dark and broken. The road to the eastern checkpoint wound through farmland that had once been golden with wheat. Now, many fields lay fallow or were cratered from artillery shells. They passed an abandoned tractor, its metal sides torn open by shrapnel. Elena had known the farmer who owned it. He had evacuated to Poland with his family, leaving everything behind. "You know," Mikhail said, breaking the silence, "my grandmother used to tell stories about women who fought in the Great Patriotic War. She said they were just as brave as any man, sometimes braver." Elena glanced at him, wondering why he was bringing this up now. "I'm just moving ammunition, Mikhail. Nothing heroic about it." "Maybe," he replied, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "But courage comes in many forms." They drove in comfortable silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. Elena found herself thinking about her life before the war. The predictable routine of treating sick animals, the quiet evenings reading veterinary journals, the plans she had made to expand the clinic. All of that seemed like someone else's life now. The checkpoint appeared ahead, a cluster of concrete barriers and sandbags manned by Ukrainian soldiers. Elena could see several figures moving behind the fortifications, their weapons ready. As they approached, a young soldier stepped out to meet them, his rifle held casually but ready to raise if needed. "Identification," he called out, though he recognized them from previous runs. Mikhail handed over their papers while Elena began unloading the ammunition crates. The soldiers at this checkpoint were mostly young men from various parts of Ukraine. Some were professional military, but others were volunteers like herself, ordinary people who had taken up arms to defend their country. "How's the situation?" Elena asked one of the soldiers as she passed him a heavy crate. "Quiet today," he replied, though his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. "But intelligence says there might be movement tonight. Reconnaissance reports suggest enemy forces are repositioning." Elena nodded, continuing her work. She had learned not to ask too many questions about military operations. The less she knew about specific plans, the better. Her job was simple: deliver the supplies and get out safely. As she worked, she noticed something different about the soldiers today. There was a tension in their movements, a sharpness to their alertness that hadn't been there on previous visits. The young officer in charge kept checking his radio, and several men were reinforcing the sandbag walls. Elena, one of the soldiers, called out. She recognized him as Dmitri, a 20-year-old from Kiev who had been drafted 3 months earlier. My rifle scope is acting up again. You wouldn't happen to know anything about fixing it, would you? Elena paused in her work. During her veterinary training, she had taken courses in equipment maintenance and repair. Animals often required specialized medical equipment, and learning to fix things had been part of her education. She had also grown up on a farm where everyone learned to repair whatever broke. Let me take a look, she said, setting down the crate she was carrying. Dmitri handed her the rifle, a standard Ukrainian military weapon that had seen considerable use. The scope was slightly loose, and Elena could see that the adjustment screws had worked themselves free from the constant vibration of transport and use. Do you have a small screwdriver? She asked. Dmitri produced a multi-tool, and Elena carefully tightened the scope mounts. She checked the alignment and made a few small adjustments, using knowledge gained from maintaining precision instruments in her veterinary practice. Try that, she said, handing the rifle back. Dmitri shouldered the weapon and looked through the scope. Much better. Thank you. Elena was about to return to unloading when the radio crackled to life. The officer listened intently, his face growing serious. He called his men together for a quick briefing while Elena and Mikhail finished their delivery. We should go, Mikhail said quietly. Something's happening. As they prepared to leave, the officer approached them. There's been a change in the situation, he said. Enemy reconnaissance has been spotted about 5 kilometers east. We're going to need you to take a different route back. He pulled out a map and showed them an alternative path that would take them north before circling back to their village. It would add an extra hour to their journey, but it would keep them away from the area where enemy forces had been seen. Elena studied the route, memorizing the turns and landmarks. She had become good at reading military maps over the past few months, another skill she never thought she would need. Be careful, the officer said as they climbed back into the truck. Radio if you run into any problems. The return journey started peacefully enough. The northern route took them through hills covered with pine trees, a landscape less scarred by the fighting. But, as they drove, Elena noticed that Mikhail seemed increasingly uncomfortable. He was shifting in his seat and occasionally grimacing. Are you all right? She asked. Just my back, he replied. All this driving on rough roads. It's nothing. But Elena could see it was more than nothing. Mikhail's face was pale, and she could see beads of sweat on his forehead despite the cool air. As a veterinarian, she had learned to read the signs of pain and distress in creatures who couldn't speak. The same skills applied to stubborn men who didn't want to admit they were hurting. 20 minutes into the return journey, Mikhail suddenly pulled the truck to the side of the road and doubled over the steering wheel. Mikhail! Elena reached for him, her medical training taking over. His pulse was rapid and irregular, and his breathing was shallow. My chest, he gasped. Feels like someone's standing on it. Elena recognized the symptoms immediately. Heart attack. She had seen it before in farmers who had pushed themselves too hard, too long. The stress of the war, the dangerous supply runs, and the worry about his son had taken their toll on Mikhail's heart. She helped him lean back in the seat and loosened his collar. Try to stay calm, she said, though she knew the irony of the instruction. They were in the middle of nowhere, with enemy forces possibly in the area, and Mikhail was having a heart attack. Elena grabbed the radio and called the checkpoint they had just left. The response was immediate but not encouraging. The nearest medical facility was over an hour away, and, with the current military situation, sending an ambulance would be extremely risky. Can you drive? The radio operator asked. Elena looked at Mikhail, who was now unconscious but still breathing. She had never driven anything larger than her small car, but the alternative was waiting for help that might not come. Yes, she replied. I can drive. She carefully moved Mikhail to the passenger seat and climbed behind the wheel. The truck was much larger and more difficult to handle than her car, but the basic principles were the same. She started the engine and slowly pulled back onto the road. The route back seemed much longer now, with Elena constantly checking on Mikhail while trying to navigate the unfamiliar controls of the old truck. Her veterinary training helped her monitor his condition, checking his pulse and breathing whenever she could safely take her hands off the wheel. As they descended from the hills into the flatter farmland near their village, Elena began to hope they would make it. Mikhail was still unconscious but stable, and the familiar landmarks of home were starting to appear. Then, she saw the vehicles blocking the road ahead. 3 military trucks sat across the highway, but they weren't Ukrainian. Elena recognized the markings and equipment as Russian. Her heart began to pound as she realized they had driven into an enemy checkpoint. She slowed the truck, her mind racing. Turning around would be suspicious and dangerous. These soldiers would have been watching the road, and any sudden movement might provoke them to open fire. But driving forward meant certain capture and possibly worse. Elena made a quick decision. She would try to bluff her way through. As she approached the checkpoint, a Russian soldier motioned for her to stop. Elena complied, rolling down the window as the soldier approached. He was young, probably not much older than Dmitry back at the Ukrainian checkpoint, but his uniform and equipment marked him as an enemy. "Documents," he said in accented Ukrainian. Elena handed over her identification papers, hoping her hands weren't shaking too visibly. The soldier looked at them carefully, then peered into the truck cab where Mikhail sat unconscious. "What's wrong with him?" the soldier asked. "Heart attack," Elena replied truthfully. "I'm trying to get him to the hospital." The soldier called over his commander, an older man with sergeant's stripes. The sergeant looked at Mikhail, then at Elena, his eyes calculating. "You're going the wrong way for the hospital," he said. "The medical facility is back that way." He pointed in the direction they had come from. Elena's mind worked frantically. She couldn't tell them about the Ukrainian checkpoint, but she needed a plausible explanation for their direction of travel. "The main road is blocked," she said. "Shell damage. We're taking the long way around." The sergeant studied her for a long moment. Elena forced herself to meet his eyes, projecting the calm confidence she had learned from dealing with frightened animals. Often, the key was not showing fear yourself. "Search the truck," the sergeant ordered. Elena's heart sank as soldiers began examining the vehicle. They would find nothing suspicious now, since they had already delivered their cargo, but the truck still smelled of ammunition and had residue that might give them away. One of the soldiers called out from the back of the truck. "Nothing here, Sergeant. Just some empty crates and old tools." The sergeant nodded, but his suspicion hadn't completely faded. "Where are you coming from?" he asked Elena. "Mikhail's farm," she replied, naming a location that was technically true, since Mikhail did own a small farm on the outskirts of their village. "And what's your relationship to him?" "Neighbor," Elena said. "His family asked me to help when he got sick." The sergeant looked at Mikhail again, noting the man's gray complexion and labored breathing. After a moment, he stepped back. "Go," he said. "But stick to the main roads. This area is not safe for civilians." Elena nodded gratefully and started the truck. As she drove away from the checkpoint, she could feel the Russian soldiers watching them. Only when they were out of sight around a bend in the road did she allow herself to breathe fully again. The rest of the journey passed without incident, though Elena remained tense until they reached the outskirts of their village. She drove directly to the small medical clinic where Dr. Kozlov was waiting. The elderly physician had been alerted by radio and was prepared for their arrival. As medical personnel carefully moved Mikhail from the truck to a stretcher, Elena finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. She had driven through an enemy checkpoint, lied to Russian soldiers, and managed to get Mikhail to safety. But, more than that, she had discovered something about herself. Dr. Kozlov approached her as she stood beside the empty truck. "You did well today," he said. "Mikhail is stable. We'll need to transport him to the regional hospital, but you saved his life." Elena nodded, still processing the events of the day. I was just moving ammunition, she said quietly. That's all I was supposed to be doing. The doctor smiled. Sometimes life asks more of us than we plan to give. As Elena walked home through the familiar streets of her village, she found herself thinking about Mikhail's words earlier that day. Courage comes in many forms. She had started the day thinking she was just helping by carrying boxes. But, when the moment came, she had done whatever was necessary. That night, as she sat in her small house, Elena realized that something had changed. The war had taken much from her and her community, but it had also revealed capabilities she never knew she possessed. Tomorrow, there would be more supply runs, more dangerous journeys to isolated checkpoints. And she would be ready. 3 weeks had passed since Mikhail's heart attack, and Elena had become the primary driver for ammunition runs. The village council had purchased a smaller, more reliable truck that was easier for her to handle, and she had quickly learned the routes to all the forward positions around Kharkiv. What started as an emergency had become her new reality. This morning was different, though. Captain Volkov, the regional supply coordinator, had requested a meeting with Elena at the central depot. She arrived early, as was her habit, and found the captain studying maps with several other officers. Elena Petrov, Captain Volkov said, looking up as she approached. I've been hearing interesting reports about your work. Elena wasn't sure if this was good or bad news. I just deliver what's needed, Captain. Yes, but you do more than that, he replied. The soldiers at Checkpoint 7 say you've been helping maintain their equipment. Checkpoint 3 reports that you've been providing medical assistance. And there's an incident report about you talking your way through an enemy roadblock. Elena shifted uncomfortably. She hadn't reported the encounter with the Russian checkpoint, hoping to avoid questions about why she had been on that particular road. Sir, I only did what was necessary. Captain Volkov smiled. That's exactly what makes you valuable. We have a special assignment, if you're willing. He led her to a detailed map of the region east of Kharkiv. There's a forward observation post here, he pointed to a location that looked very isolated. 12 soldiers, dug in about 3 kilometers from enemy lines. They've been cut off for 4 days now. Regular supply convoys can't get through because the area is too hot. Elena studied the map. The position was indeed isolated, accessible only by a narrow forest road that wound through several kilometers of disputed territory. We need someone to make a night run, the captain continued. Small vehicle, minimal profile, someone who knows how to handle unexpected situations. The soldiers there are low on ammunition and completely out of medical supplies. 2 of them are wounded and need antibiotics urgently. Elena realized what he was asking. This wasn't a regular supply run to a secure checkpoint. This was a dangerous mission into active combat zone. When, she asked. Tonight. New moon, good for concealment. You'll have a guide, a local partisan who knows the back roads. But, Elena, I want to be clear about the risks. If you're captured in that area, the enemy won't treat you as a civilian. Elena thought about the soldiers she had met over the past months. Young men like Dmitri, far from home, doing their duty despite the dangers. She thought about the wounded men waiting in that forward position, counting on someone to reach them. I'll do it, she said. Captain Volkov nodded, as if he had expected this answer. Your guide is Maria Sokolova. She's been running intelligence operations in that sector for 2 months. Meet her at the depot tonight at 2200 hours. Elena spent the rest of the day preparing. She checked and double-checked her truck, ensuring it was in perfect mechanical condition. She packed the medical supplies herself, making sure she understood what each item was for. Her veterinary training proved useful again, as many of the antibiotics and pain medications were familiar to her. As evening approached, Elena found herself more nervous than usual. Previous runs had been dangerous, but this felt different. She was deliberately heading into an area where people were actively trying to kill each other. Maria Sokolova turned out to be a woman in her 50s with gray streaks in her dark hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She had grown up in these forests and knew every trail and creek. Before the war, she had been a forest ranger. Now, she used that knowledge to help Ukrainian forces move unseen through enemy-held territory. The key is patience, Maria explained as they loaded the truck. We move slowly, stop often to listen, and trust our instincts. The enemy has patrols in this area, but they stick to main roads mostly. We'll use hunters' paths that most people don't even know exist. Elena listened carefully, adding this information to everything else she had learned over the past months. Driving at night without lights, reading terrain in darkness, moving silently through hostile territory, these weren't skills she had ever expected to need. They left the depot at exactly 2,200 hours, driving north on main roads for the first 30 minutes. The truck's headlights were covered with special filters that reduced their visibility while still allowing Elena to see the road. Maria navigated using a combination of GPS and her intimate knowledge of the landscape. "Turn here," Maria said quietly, indicating a dirt track that Elena almost missed in the darkness. The road, if it could be called that, wound through dense forest. Elena had to concentrate intensely to avoid the trees and rocks that suddenly appeared in their path. The truck's engine seemed impossibly loud in the silence of the night, and she found herself constantly expecting to hear shouts or gunfire. After an hour of careful driving, Maria held up her hand for Elena to stop. They sat in complete silence for several minutes, listening for any sounds that didn't belong to the forest. Elena could hear her own heartbeat and the distant sound of artillery fire, but nothing closer. "Good," Maria whispered. "We continue." They crossed several small streams where the truck had to navigate carefully to avoid getting stuck in the muddy banks. Maria had Elena stop frequently to check their position and listen for enemy movement. Each stop made Elena more nervous, but she was beginning to understand the rhythm of this kind of operation. Around midnight, they encountered their first real challenge. Maria spotted vehicle lights moving along a road about a kilometer away, too organized and regular to be anything but a military patrol. "Enemy convoy," Maria whispered. "We wait." They sat in darkness for 20 minutes while the lights slowly moved across their field of vision. Elena counted at least 6 vehicles, probably a supply convoy or patrol change. The knowledge that enemy soldiers were so close made her mouth dry and her hands shake slightly. When the lights finally disappeared, they continued deeper into the disputed territory. The forest began to show signs of the fighting that had swept through the area. Shell craters interrupted the tree line, and Elena could see the twisted remains of vehicles that had been destroyed in earlier battles. "Almost there," Maria said as they crested a small hill. Elena could see their destination ahead, a carefully camouflaged position dug into the hillside. It was so well hidden that she might have driven past it without noticing if Maria hadn't pointed it out. A figure emerged from the darkness as they approached. Elena recognized the challenge and response procedure that Captain Volkov had taught her. The guard led them to a concealed entrance where the rest of the soldiers waited. The forward observation post was more sophisticated than Elena had expected. The soldiers had dug a complex of interconnected bunkers and trenches, all covered with logs and camouflage netting. Inside, the positions were warm and dry, heated by small, carefully ventilated stoves. Lieutenant Kravchenko, the position commander, was a professional soldier in his 30s who had been fighting since the war began. His relief at seeing the supply truck was obvious, though he tried to maintain military bearing. "We had begun to wonder if anyone remembered we were out here," he said as Elena began unloading medical supplies. "How are the wounded?" she asked. "Sergeant Bonder has shrapnel in his leg, infected now. Private Zukhanov took a bullet in the shoulder 3 days ago. Both need antibiotics urgently." Elena examined the wounded men using the flashlight with a red filter that wouldn't compromise night vision. Sergeant Bonder was running a fever, and the wound in his leg showed clear signs of infection. Private Zukhanov was in better condition, but his shoulder wound needed proper cleaning and dressing. Using her veterinary experience, Elena cleaned and treated both wounds, administering antibiotics and showing the position's medic how to continue the treatment. She had learned long ago that infection was often more dangerous than the original injury, whether in animals or humans. While she worked on the wounded, the other soldiers unloaded ammunition and supplies. Elena noticed that these men moved with the quiet efficiency of veterans. They had been living on the edge of enemy territory for weeks, and it showed in their alertness and economy of movement. Intelligence reports suggest enemy forces are planning something, Lieutenant Kravchenko told Maria quietly. Increased radio traffic, more patrols. We've been calling for extraction, but command wants us to maintain observation. Elena finished treating the wounded and joined the conversation. How long can you hold here? With these supplies, maybe another week, the lieutenant replied. But if they come in force, we'll have to fall back. This position is good for observation, but it's not designed to withstand a direct assault. Elena found herself studying the defensive preparations with new eyes. Over the past months, she had absorbed military knowledge almost by osmosis, learning from soldiers and officers at every checkpoint. She was beginning to understand tactics and strategy in ways that surprised her. The supply route we used tonight, she said to Maria. Could it handle vehicles larger than our truck? Maria considered the question. Possibly. Why do you ask? If these soldiers need to evacuate quickly, they'll need transportation. And if the enemy is planning an offensive, other positions might need resupply before it happens. Lieutenant Kravchenko looked at Elena with new respect. You're thinking like a soldier. Elena shrugged. I'm thinking like someone who doesn't want to see good men die because they didn't have what they needed. They finished the resupply operation quickly and prepared to leave. The return journey had to be completed before dawn, when their movement would become much more dangerous. As they loaded the empty crates back into the truck, Elena felt a strange reluctance to leave these soldiers behind. We'll be back, she told Lieutenant Kravchenko. Whatever happens, we'll get you what you need. The return journey was tense but uneventful. Maria guided them along a slightly different route to avoid establishing a pattern that enemy forces might detect. By the time they reached the main road, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. As they drove back to the depot, Elena found herself processing what she had experienced. The professional competence of the soldiers in the forward position, the constant awareness of danger, the matter-of-fact way they dealt with wounds and fear, it was different from anything in her previous life, but it felt important in a way that her old routine never had. You did well tonight, Maria said as they approached the depot. Most civilians would have been too frightened to function out there. Elena considered this. I was frightened. But there was work to be done. Back at the depot, Captain Volkov was waiting for their return. Elena gave him a detailed report on the condition of the forward position and the status of the wounded soldiers. She also shared her observations about the defensive preparations and her concerns about the position's vulnerability. The lieutenant is right to be concerned, the captain said after hearing her report. Intelligence confirms that enemy forces are preparing for an offensive in that sector. We may need to evacuate that position within the next few days. Elena felt a chill at this news. What about the other forward positions? Are they at risk too? Potentially. That's why your work is becoming even more critical. We need reliable people who can reach isolated positions quickly and safely. As Elena drove home in the morning light, she reflected on how much her life had changed. 6 months ago, her biggest concern had been a difficult calving or a sick horse. Now, she was making nighttime runs through enemy territory, treating wounded soldiers, and thinking about military tactics. But, perhaps most surprisingly, she found that this new life made sense to her in ways her old routine never had. There was a clarity of purpose in this work, a direct connection between her actions and the survival of people who were fighting for their country's freedom. That afternoon, Elena visited Mikhail in the regional hospital where he was recovering. His condition had stabilized, but he would need several more weeks of treatment before he could return home. I heard about your night run, he said, his eyes bright with interest despite his medical condition. Elena wasn't surprised that news had traveled. Military communities were small, and word spread quickly about successful operations. Just moving ammunition, she replied, echoing her words from weeks before. Mikhail laughed, then winced as the movement strained his healing heart. Elena, you're not just moving ammunition anymore. You're saving lives. There's a difference. As she drove home, Elena thought about Mikhail's words. He was right, of course. What had started as a simple job helping her community had evolved into something much more significant. She was no longer just Elena Petrov, the village veterinarian. She was becoming something new, something she didn't yet have a name for. That evening, Captain Volkov called with another assignment. 3 forward positions needed emergency resupply before the expected enemy offensive. 2 of them were in areas where regular convoys couldn't operate safely. Elena looked at the maps, studied the routes, and calculated the risks. Then, she picked up her keys. There was work to be done. The enemy offensive began at dawn on a Tuesday morning with a massive artillery barrage that could be heard 50 kilometers away. Elena was loading supplies for another night run when the radio crackled with urgent messages from forward positions calling for immediate support. Captain Volkov burst into the supply depot with maps and urgent orders. The attack we expected has started, he announced to Elena and the other drivers. 3 forward positions are under direct assault. Regular evacuation routes are compromised. Elena studied the tactical map with growing alarm. The forward observation post she had visited just 2 nights before was marked with a red circle, indicating it was under enemy attack. Lieutenant Kravchenko and his soldiers were fighting for their lives. What do you need? Elena asked. Emergency evacuation runs, the captain replied grimly. Small vehicles only, using secondary routes. The enemy has cut the main roads with artillery fire. Elena felt her stomach tighten. Emergency evacuation meant driving into active combat to extract wounded soldiers. This was far beyond anything she had done before, but she could see in the captain's eyes that there weren't many alternatives. I'll take the northern route, she said, pointing to the path that led to Lieutenant Kravchenko's position. Captain Volkov shook his head. Elena, that position may already be overrun. The last radio contact was 20 minutes ago, and it wasn't good news. Then, we need to find out for sure, Elena replied. If any of those soldiers are still alive, we can't abandon them. The captain studied her for a moment. Take Corporal Denisov with you, he said finally. And, Elena, if you encounter enemy forces, don't try to be a hero. Turn around and come back. Corporal Denisov was a young soldier who had been wounded in an earlier action and was now assigned to depot security while he recovered. He was grateful for the chance to help his fellow soldiers, even in his limited capacity. As they prepared the truck for the evacuation run, Elena loaded not just medical supplies but also additional ammunition and a stretcher. She had a feeling they would need everything they could carry. Ma'am, Corporal Denisov said as they checked their equipment, I should mention that I've never done anything like this before. Elena almost smiled despite the tension. Neither had I, until recently. We'll figure it out as we go. The journey to the forward position was unlike any of Elena's previous runs. Instead of the careful, stealthy approach she had learned from Maria, this trip required speed and boldness. Artillery shells were falling randomly across the area, and smoke from burning vehicles and buildings created an almost constant haze. They had to detour twice when they found roads blocked by destroyed vehicles or fresh shell craters. Elena was learning to read the landscape of active warfare, distinguishing between old damage and new threats. Vehicle ahead, Corporal Denisov called out, pointing to military trucks moving along a parallel road about a kilometer away. Elena grabbed binoculars and studied the vehicles. Ukrainian, she said with relief, recognizing the markings. Probably reinforcements moving to counter the offensive. But, as they got closer to the forward position, the signs became more ominous. Fresh shell craters dotted the hillside where Lieutenant Kravchenko's observation post was located. Trees had been shattered by explosions, and Elena could see the smoke rising from what might have been equipment fires. I don't see any movement, Corporal Denisov observed as they approached the area where they had entered the position 2 nights before. Elena parked the truck in a concealed location and they approached on foot. The camouflaged entrance to the bunker complex was still intact, but there was no sign of the guards who should have challenged them. "Hello?" Elena called out softly. "Lieutenant Kravchenko?" A weak voice responded from inside the bunker. "Here. We're here." Elena and Corporal Denisov carefully entered the position. What they found was devastating. The enemy attack had been intense and sustained. Several of the soldiers were dead, killed when a direct artillery hit had collapsed part of the bunker system. Lieutenant Kravchenko was alive but badly wounded, along with 3 other soldiers. "How long since the attack stopped?" Elena asked as she began examining the wounded. "Maybe an hour," Lieutenant Kravchenko replied, his voice strained with pain. "They pulled back, but they'll be back. This position is compromised." Elena worked quickly to stabilize the wounded. Lieutenant Kravchenko had taken shrapnel in his chest and was bleeding internally. One soldier had a broken leg from falling debris. Another was unconscious with a head injury. The 4th wounded man was Private Zukhanov, whose shoulder wound she had treated 2 nights before. He had been hit again, this time in the arm. "We need to evacuate immediately," Elena told Corporal Denisov. "Help me get them to the truck." Moving the wounded soldiers was difficult and dangerous work. Elena had to make quick medical decisions about how to transport each man safely. Her veterinary experience proved invaluable again, as she had often dealt with injured animals that couldn't communicate their pain clearly. The soldier with the head injury was the most critical case. Elena recognized the signs of severe concussion and possible skull fracture. Moving him incorrectly could cause permanent damage or death, but leaving him behind meant certain death when enemy forces returned. "We'll take the unconscious one first," she decided. "Corporal, help me rig a proper stretcher." They used equipment from the bunker to create an improvised medical transport system. Elena drew on everything she had learned about treating trauma injuries, applying techniques she had used on animals to stabilize the human patients. Loading the wounded into the truck required careful planning. Elena arranged them so that she could monitor their conditions during transport while Corporal Denisov helped secure them safely. As they prepared to leave, Lieutenant Kravchenko grabbed Elena's arm. "The observation equipment," he said weakly. "Can't let the enemy get it." Elena looked at the sophisticated radio and optical equipment that had made this position valuable. She understood its importance, but the truck was already overloaded with wounded men. "I'll destroy it," Corporal Denisov volunteered. While he set charges to demolish the sensitive equipment, Elena made final preparations for the evacuation. She checked each wounded soldier's condition and reviewed the route back to safety. The explosion that destroyed the observation post equipment also served as a signal that their position was no longer secret. As they drove away from the hillside, Elena could see enemy vehicles moving in the distance, probably coming to investigate the smoke and noise. The evacuation journey was a nightmare of medical emergencies and tactical challenges. Elena had to drive fast enough to stay ahead of enemy forces while keeping the vehicle stable enough not to worsen the injuries of her patients. Halfway back to safety, the soldier with the head injury went into cardiac arrest. Elena had to stop the truck and perform emergency resuscitation while Corporal Denisov watched for enemy pursuit. She used techniques she had learned for reviving animals in distress, adapted for human physiology. "Come on," she whispered as she performed chest compressions. "Don't give up now." After several terrifying minutes, the soldier's heartbeat returned. Elena got him stabilized and they continued their race to the medical facility. Lieutenant Kravchenko lost consciousness during the drive, and Elena could see he was bleeding more heavily despite her efforts to control it. She made the difficult decision to push the truck to its maximum speed, knowing that reaching medical care quickly was more important than a perfectly smooth ride. They reached the field hospital just as Elena thought she might lose another patient. Medical personnel rushed to meet them, taking over care of the wounded soldiers with professional efficiency that both impressed and relieved Elena. Dr. Kozlov, who had treated Mikhail weeks before, was among the medical team. "Excellent work," he told Elena as they transferred the last patient. Your field treatment probably saved at least 2 lives. Elena felt a wave of exhaustion as the adrenaline of the evacuation mission faded. She had been running on pure determination and medical training, but now that the soldiers were safe, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what they had accomplished. "The lieutenant?" she asked. "Touch and go," Dr. Kozlov replied honestly. "But he has a chance, thanks to your quick action on the internal bleeding." Captain Volkov arrived at the hospital an hour later with reports from the other evacuation missions. 2 more forward positions had been successfully evacuated, though several soldiers had been killed in the enemy offensive. "Elena," he said, "I have a proposition for you." Elena looked up from the coffee that someone had pressed into her hands. "Sir? How would you feel about formal military training? Combat medic certification, tactical driving, advanced communications. We need people like you, but with proper preparation." Elena considered the offer. 3 months ago, she would have been horrified at the idea of joining the military. But 3 months ago, she had been a different person. What would that involve? Specialized training at the military academy. 6 weeks intensive course covering medical training, tactical operations, equipment maintenance, and leadership skills. After that, assignment to a rapid response unit that handles exactly the kind of missions you've been doing. Elena thought about Lieutenant Kravchenko fighting for his life in the hospital bed behind them. She thought about the soldiers at isolated positions who depended on supply runs and evacuations. She thought about Maria Sokolova, using her forest knowledge to help Ukrainian forces move unseen. "When would I start?" she asked. Captain Volkov smiled. "Next Monday, if you're willing." That evening, Elena returned to her village to collect personal items and arrange for someone to care for her veterinary practice during her absence. The village seemed strangely peaceful after the day's events, though everyone had heard the distant artillery fire and knew that the war was escalating. Her neighbor, Mrs. Kovalenko, was waiting at Elena's house with questions and concerns. "Is it true you're joining the army?" she asked. "Specialized training," Elena replied. "To help soldiers who are wounded or trapped." Mrs. Kovalenko, whose grandson was fighting near Donetsk, nodded with understanding. "Someone has to do it. Better someone we know and trust." As Elena packed her belongings that night, she reflected on the path that had brought her to this decision. It had started with simple humanitarian work, helping to deliver supplies to soldiers defending their country. But each mission had taught her new skills and revealed new capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. The young veterinarian who had reluctantly agreed to help move ammunition boxes seemed like a stranger now. In her place was someone who could perform emergency medical procedures under fire, navigate hostile territory in darkness, and make life-or-death decisions under extreme pressure. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from the hospital. Lieutenant Kravchenko had stabilized and was expected to make a full recovery. The soldier with the head injury was awake and responsive. All 4 of the wounded soldiers from the evacuation mission were going to survive. Elena smiled as she finished packing. Tomorrow, she would begin a new chapter of her life, one that would require skills and courage she was still discovering. But tonight, 4 soldiers were alive who might not have been without her actions. That was enough to make it all worthwhile. As she turned off the lights in her small house, Elena thought about the observation she had made weeks before. She had started out just moving ammunition. But ammunition was useless without people trained to use it effectively, and people were useless without proper medical support, reliable transportation, and secure communications. Everything was connected in war. And Elena was beginning to understand her place in that larger picture. The formal training would teach her new skills, but the real education had happened over the past months as she learned to adapt, improvise, and overcome challenges she had never imagined facing. Elena Petrov, veterinarian, was ready to become something new. 6 weeks later, Elena emerged from the military academy transformed. The specialized training had been intense and comprehensive, covering everything from advanced trauma medicine to small unit tactics. She now wore the uniform of a Ukrainian army combat medic with the additional qualifications of tactical driver and emergency response specialist. Her first assignment was to a newly formed rapid response unit commanded by Major Petrov, no relation, despite the shared surname. The unit's mission was to provide immediate medical support and evacuation services to frontline positions that regular medical units couldn't reach safely. Elena's new team consisted of 5 other specialists, each with unique skills that complemented her own abilities. There was Sergeant Major Volkov, a veteran medic with 15 years of experience, Corporal Semenov, a communications specialist who could establish contact with anyone anywhere, Private Stepanov, a mechanic who could fix anything with wheels, and, most surprisingly, Maria Sokolova, the forest guide who had taught Elena how to move unseen through hostile territory. "Welcome to the unit," Major Petrov said during Elena's first briefing. "Your job description is simple: go places other people can't go, do things other people can't do, and bring everyone home alive." Elena's first official mission came that same afternoon. A Ukrainian reconnaissance patrol had been ambushed near the town of Izium, about 40 kilometers behind enemy lines. 3 soldiers were wounded and trapped in a destroyed building, unable to move without assistance. Regular rescue forces couldn't reach them because the area was under constant enemy surveillance. "This is why we formed this unit," Major Petrov explained as he showed Elena the mission parameters on a tactical map. "Small team, specialized equipment, and people who know how to think on their feet." Elena studied the map with her new military training, identifying enemy positions, potential routes, and extraction points. The mission would require infiltration at night, medical treatment under fire, and extraction through hostile territory. It was exactly the kind of challenge she had been preparing for. The team departed at sunset, using a specially modified vehicle that was faster and more maneuverable than the trucks Elena had used for her earlier supply runs. The vehicle was equipped with advanced medical equipment, communications gear, and defensive systems that could provide protection during evacuations. Maria Sokolova guided them through forest paths that Elena recognized from her previous missions, but now she understood the tactical principles behind the route selection. Every turn and stop was calculated to minimize exposure while maintaining rapid access to extraction points. "Enemy checkpoint ahead," Corporal Semenov reported, monitoring radio intercepts. "Looks like they're stopping all vehicles on the main road." Elena felt the familiar tension of approaching danger, but now it was tempered by professional training and confidence in her team's capabilities. She was no longer an amateur volunteer hoping to avoid disaster. She was a qualified combat medic with the skills and equipment to handle whatever they encountered. They bypassed the enemy checkpoint using one of Maria's forest routes, but the detour added an extra hour to their approach time. When they finally reached the outskirts of Izium, Elena could see the destroyed building where the Ukrainian patrol was trapped. "Building's been hit by artillery," Sergeant Major Volkov observed through binoculars. "Structure's unstable, and there are enemy patrols in the area." Elena studied the tactical situation with her new understanding of combat operations. The trapped soldiers were in an upper floor of a partially collapsed building. Enemy forces controlled the surrounding streets, but they seemed to be treating the area as secure, not expecting Ukrainian rescue operations. "We need a diversion," Elena said. "Something to draw their attention away from the building." Major Petrov, who was monitoring the mission from the command post, responded over the radio. "Negative on diversions. Too risky. Find another approach." Elena looked at the building again, considering alternatives. Her veterinary background had taught her to think creatively about access problems. Animals often trapped themselves in difficult locations, and rescuing them required innovative approaches. There, she pointed to a partially collapsed wall that created a natural ramp to the second floor. "We can approach from the rear, use that rubble as cover." The team moved carefully through the destroyed neighborhood, avoiding the main streets where enemy patrols were active. Elena was struck by the civilian cost of the war: houses where families had lived, shops where children had bought candy, all reduced to rubble and debris. They reached the trapped soldiers without being detected. Elena found 3 men in serious condition, wounded in the ambush that had killed their companions. The most severely injured soldier had taken a bullet in the abdomen and was bleeding internally. The other 2 had suffered shrapnel wounds and possible concussions from artillery explosions. Working in near darkness with only filtered flashlights, Elena and Sergeant Major Volkov stabilized the wounded soldiers for transport. Elena's training had taught her to work efficiently in austere conditions, but her experience over the past months had taught her the emotional strength needed to stay calm while treating badly injured people. "This one needs surgery immediately," Elena told Maria over the radio. "Internal bleeding that I can't control in the field." "Understood," Maria replied. "Extraction route is clear. Enemy patrols have moved to the eastern sector." Moving the wounded soldiers out of the unstable building required careful coordination. Elena had to balance the urgency of their medical needs against the structural danger of the collapsed building and the tactical threat of enemy forces. They carried the soldiers one by one to the waiting vehicle, using stretchers designed for tactical evacuations. Elena monitored each patient's vital signs continuously, adjusting treatment as needed during the extraction. As they prepared to depart, enemy forces discovered the rescue operation. Searchlights swept the area and Elena could hear shouted orders in Russian. The element of surprise was lost, and they would have to fight their way out. "Contact!" Corporal Semenov called out as enemy soldiers appeared at the end of the street. Elena found herself in her first firefight. All her months of gradual introduction to military life culminated in this moment where she had to function as a combat medic under direct enemy fire. Private Stepanov drove the vehicle while Elena and Sergeant Major Volkov worked frantically to keep the wounded soldiers stable despite the jolting movement and the stress of combat. Maria coordinated their escape route while Corporal Semenov maintained communications with supporting units. "Left turn ahead," Maria called out. "There's a bridge that can handle our vehicle weight." Elena barely registered the tactical details as she focused on her primary responsibility, keeping 3 badly wounded soldiers alive during a high-speed escape through hostile territory. This was what all her training had prepared her for, the ability to perform complex medical procedures while under extreme stress. The soldier with internal bleeding went into shock during the escape. Elena had to perform emergency procedures in the back of a moving vehicle while bullets occasionally struck the armored sides. She drew on every bit of training and experience she possessed, using techniques learned from veterinary practice, military medicine, and months of improvised fieldwork. "Got him stabilized," she reported as the soldier's vital signs improved. "But we need to reach surgery within 30 minutes. "Roger that," came Major Petrov's voice over the radio. "Medical evacuation helicopter is en route to extraction point Alpha." The helicopter evacuation was Elena's first experience with military air medical transport. The crew was professional and efficient, taking over care of the wounded soldiers with seamless coordination. Elena provided detailed medical reports on each patient's condition and treatment while the aircraft flew toward the field hospital. All 3 soldiers survived. The one with internal bleeding required emergency surgery, but Elena's field treatment had prevented him from bleeding to death during the evacuation. The other 2 recovered completely and returned to duty within weeks. "Outstanding work," Major Petrov told Elena during the mission debrief. "Textbook medical care under extremely difficult conditions." Elena felt a satisfaction different from anything she had experienced in her previous life. These weren't abstract accomplishments or routine successes. 3 men were alive and would return to their families because she and her team had been willing and able to risk their lives for fellow soldiers. Over the following months, Elena participated in dozens of similar missions. Each one was different, presenting unique challenges that required creative solutions and professional competence under pressure. She rescued helicopter crews shot down behind enemy lines, provided medical support for special operations, and evacuation services for isolated outposts. The most significant mission came in late spring when intelligence reported that a Ukrainian prisoner of war camp had been established in a school near Mariupol. Satellite imagery suggested that dozens of captured Ukrainian soldiers and civilians were being held there under harsh conditions. "This is beyond our usual mission scope," Major Petrov explained during the briefing. "But you're the most qualified team for this type of operation." Elena studied the intelligence reports with growing concern. The facility was heavily guarded and located deep in enemy-controlled territory. Getting in would be difficult enough, getting out with dozens of weakened prisoners would be nearly impossible. "What's the plan?" she asked. "Coordinated operation with partisan forces and special operations units. Your job is medical support for the prisoners once we get them out. Many will need immediate treatment for malnutrition, disease, and injuries." The mission launched on a moonless night in May. Elena's team was part of a larger force that included Ukrainian special operations soldiers and local partisan fighters led by experienced commanders. The operation was the most complex military action Elena had ever participated in. The assault on the prisoner facility was swift and decisive. Ukrainian forces overwhelmed the guards before they could harm the prisoners or call for reinforcements. Elena rushed into the building where the prisoners were held, prepared for the worst. What she found exceeded her worst expectations. Dozens of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians, including several women and children, had been held in deplorable conditions. Many showed signs of malnutrition, disease, and physical abuse. Elena's medical training had prepared her for trauma injuries, but not for the systematic effects of prolonged imprisonment and mistreatment. "Triage," Sergeant Major Volkov called out. "Identify the most critical cases first." Elena moved quickly among the prisoners, using her medical training to assess each person's condition. Years of veterinary practice had taught her to make rapid medical decisions based on limited information, and that experience proved invaluable in the chaos of the liberation. Several prisoners required immediate medical attention. Elena worked with the other medics to stabilize the most critical cases while organizing the evacuation of all the prisoners. The logistics of moving dozens of weakened people through hostile territory required careful planning and constant medical monitoring. The evacuation took 12 hours, moving in small groups through forest paths that Maria and other guides had scouted in advance. Elena provided medical care throughout the journey, treating everything from infected wounds to dehydration and psychological trauma. When they finally reached safety, Elena collapsed from exhaustion. She had been working continuously for 18 hours, providing medical care under extreme stress while moving through enemy territory. But every prisoner had survived the rescue operation. "Elena," Major Petrov said as she recovered in the medical tent, "you've done something remarkable." Elena looked at him tiredly. "I was just doing my job." "No," he replied. "Your job was to provide medical support for a rescue operation. What you did was lead a humanitarian mission that saved dozens of lives. There's a difference." In the weeks that followed, Elena received formal recognition for her role in the prisoner rescue operation. She was promoted to staff sergeant and awarded the Order of Courage, one of Ukraine's highest military decorations. More importantly to her, all the rescued prisoners made full recoveries and were reunited with their families. As she prepared for her next mission, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had started out as a reluctant volunteer, helping to move ammunition boxes because someone needed to do the work. That simple decision had led her through months of gradual transformation, each mission teaching her new skills and revealing new capabilities. Now, she was a professional soldier and medical specialist, trained to operate in the most dangerous situations and save lives under impossible conditions. The veterinarian who had once treated sick farm animals had become someone who could perform emergency surgery under enemy fire and lead rescue operations in hostile territory. "Ready for the next one?" Corporal Semenov asked as they prepared for another mission. Elena checked her medical equipment and reviewed the mission briefings. Somewhere out there, Ukrainian soldiers were wounded or trapped, counting on people like her to reach them when no one else could. "Ready," she replied. The war had taken much from Elena and her country, but it had also revealed something important about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. When the moment came to choose between safety and duty, between comfort and courage, between self-preservation and service to others, Elena and thousands like her had chosen to do whatever was necessary. She had started out just moving ammunition. But ammunition was only the beginning. In the end, the most important thing she had learned to move was herself, toward danger when others needed help, toward responsibility when others couldn't act, toward a version of herself that she had never known existed. As the convoy pulled out for another mission, Elena smiled at the irony. She was finally doing exactly what she had always done, caring for those who couldn't care for themselves. The only difference was the scale and stakes involved. Some things, she realized, never really change. They just become more important.